Hello everyone. So I know this iridescent skirt and all the blending therein is sort of driving a lot of us nuts. So as promised, a little demo on how I would probably tackle it. So this is a technique of dry layering that I use a lot when I want something to be very controlled. It works particularly well on fabrics that have a high reflective quality or a very stiff hand like this taffeta because it kind of creates those angles. So the first thing I've picked out is this bright yellowy green that I see in the reflected points. That's my highlight essentially now. I'm not seeing a bright white highlight on this, but I am seeing these shifts to this yellowy green in small areas. And so I'm going ahead and painting the whole thing with that, but focusing the concentration of it in the places where I see it the most. So you don't want like a stark line of it. You want it to kind of bleed out. It's going to help add vibrancy to my blues so I don't have to do as much perfect mixing as it layers over. I am using a rag and some water here to pull out a couple areas that have a very cool quality, almost a cold purpley kind of quality in some of the shadows where this green would make it too hot. So I'm going ahead and using a rag and pulling those out. So I've blow dried this. The underlayer is now completely dry. And we're sort of going to identify midtones and shadows. I'm going to go ahead and really, really lightly draw in some of those shapes that you can see for where the shadows are. I don't do this always when I'm drawing, but especially if something's very complicated, it can help to kind of draw the shadow shapes and the mid-tone shapes so it's almost becoming a paint by number kind of situation, but also helps you plan it. So I'm seeing about 3 big shadows. There's one in a deep fold on the right, one in a very deep fold on the left that's actually our darkest shadow, and then there's a little bit of bounce shadow on the inside edge of the left skirt where it turns towards the black velvet. So I've got a little bit of blue, I've mixed in a little bit of purple to dull it down, and knowing that when it mixes with the green, which has yellows in it, it's going to also sort of, the red and the purple and the yellow of the green are going to kind of counteract and dull it a little bit. So it's going to make a more neutral color that kind of will help sell that that's a shadow and that's receding backwards into space. There's a couple small little wrinkles, things like that around the waistline that I'm also touching with that color. And then as it moves to the other side of the figure, our shadow actually warms up and has a bit more of the green in it. So I'm going to do all of our purpley tones on this side, and then I'm going to kind of dilute it down and add a bit more blue back in before I hop over to the other side. I'm kind of feathering these in because of the hand of the fabric and the high reflective quality of the fabric. All of our shadows and our highlights are more angular, they're more defined. They're not as soft and diffused as they move across the fabric, which is why this dry on dry technique works pretty well for things like that. Also, since we're working dry, the color is sitting on top of the other color, but the wetter my paint is, the more it's going to reactivate the paint underneath it and mix up. So I'm trying to work, if I'm in a big area, maybe going ahead and letting it be pretty wet, like for this area, pretty diffused, diluted wash. So it's going to pull more of the green up, which, as we mentioned, the shadow has a little bit more green in it, so it's working for us. But if I want it to be more pure, the color that I'm laying down, not to mix with things underneath it, I'm going to want to work drier. So as we get to the next couple layers, we're going to start getting it drier. But right now, just blocking in these shadow shapes. And you can see, I know it looks kind of crazy. So we've done our highest highlights, and now we're adding in our shadows. And now we're going to start mixing and creating our mids. So I mixed kind of a bright blue, a little bit of turquoise in it, and I'm washing that over the shadow areas and over my midtones, but keeping that green at the bright point. Because I've got a lot of water in it, because it's very diluted, it's mixing with the green underneath it, and it's very warm, very bright, very vibrant. It's like too green for what we want, but it's a nice medium tone for getting out of that bright green and into our blues. So we're bridging the gap between our shadow color and our highlight color. So this is how you get from a cool tone with a purple cast all the way to a yellow green. We've got to create colors in between them to get there. So I'm using that turquoisey translucent color to block in all my midtones. and to create areas and soften edges between that shadow and heading into the highlights. Paying special attention to like a little bit of those tiny shadows you're going to see as like a curve turns away from you. You're only going to get that bright green highlight on the edge that's facing you, and even though it's a very small tight area, it is going to like shadow as it turns towards the skirt, so making sure we catch some of that. And then noting that this does look much greener, I'm adding more pigment to the wash as I'm going and making it more saturated, so it's going to kind of cover the layers underneath it more pigment, less translucent, right? Now, since this is all wet, I'm going to go ahead and let this dry before I do one last pass where we aim it to get it more blue. So we've got the color and the light in there, but it is much more green than I want it to be, and it could use a little bit of toning. So we're going to kind of do a thin translucent wash over a bunch of different areas here and not mind that's going to wet. So this is a little more like wet blending. So the first one I'm mixing is a color to prime our shadow areas. It's a muddy kind of deep blue. There's a little bit of purple, a little bit of green, so it's got a grayish quality to it. You can see I try to swatch all my colors on the paper clean on the sides so you can kind of see what I'm working with. Now, because my blue-green is too green, I'm not going to add any green to this wash. I'm going to use a pure, bright, like royal blue and see how quickly it like mutes down that color. I'm kind of putting my brush down on wherever the deepest shadow parts are, where I wouldn't mind it going much bluer. And then as I get less pigment on my brush, pulling it towards my highlights so that I don't obliterate them. But we do want to tone them. Those areas of green in the reference image are quite small and like thin little lines. So we're closing those midtones, so those highlights are very small. Mixing more cool tones, more blue. It's going to take a lot of pigment to cover some of those green areas, which is also helping me bump up my saturation across the board, right? The underpainting adds some richness. So here I'm mixing with a really, really bright blue, and I'm only using that in areas where it's okay. It's starting to shift green because a brighter blue has a little green in it. Layered on top of green, it's going to stay green. So we're sort of starting to get there, but we'd like to start popping in just a few, like closing in that yellow-green. So I kind of drew where I want it to go on the reference image, but we want to even make that area smaller to bring our midtones closer together. So it's just this little tiny like sliver of bright green showing through. Having underneath all those colors makes this easy because I'm really just like walking them over it, and it also adds some like nice richness and sheen quality to it that I'm not trying to mix it on top. It would come across as very, very bright. And there's always the chance that I'd be mixing on top wet and it would cause like blossoms and edges on top of all the other layers I'd already done. So we're kind of preserving as much as we can by putting it underneath. Now that we've made that a smaller highlight area, I do like to take a white colored pencil to do that surge edge on the bottom of that skirt that I wish I could get rid of. And there are a few spots that look almost like where it's catching the grain of the fabric. You can use a little white colored pencil, or even maybe, depending on your photo reference, a yellow colored pencil, something like that, and kind of a skipping line. It's not solid, it's not like a line all the way down, but just to pull forward a couple of the very edges of those brighter highlights and to define the shape of your piece. That top corner has a bit more purple tone to me that I think got a little absorbed, so touching it with just a touch of pretty red is kind of maroon so that it will mix with the blues underneath it, make it a little more purple, and there we have it. That is how I would tackle this skirt. I hope that helps. Good luck.